Chapter 9 covers hypothesis testing, particularly with one sample. This is inferential statistics, just like confidence intervals were. So we are trying to, in inferential statistics, come up with a decision about our population or make a generalization about our population, just as a reminder. Chapter 9 is going to be broken up into two parts. So we'll start off with this first part covering sections 1, 3, and 4, and then the next part will cover 2 and 5. So we are going to start off by kind of comparing what confidence intervals do versus what hypothesis testing does. So a confidence interval, like we looked at in last chapter, what we're actually doing with those is answering an open-ended question about a mean or a proportion for our population, such as what is the mean private university by state tuition? Okay, it's an open-ended question about what the mean tuition is. We're looking to answer that question with an estimate, and it ends up being an interval estimate. Okay, other examples of open-ended questions would be, what is the percentage of patients who take a new migraine drug that experience the side effect of insomnia? Open-ended question, we're looking to answer that with an estimate. And then another example, what is the mean amount of caffeine in a cup of coffee? Okay, a confidence interval is, like we have said, an estimate of a population parameter, so mu or p for proportion. Okay, now let's talk about a hypothesis test. It answers a question as well, but it answers a specific question about whether a mean or proportion equals a fixed value. So a question like, is mean private university by state tuition equal to $20,000? So that $20,000 is that fixed value, and we're specifically asking whether this mean is equal to that. Another example is the percentage of patients who take a new migraine drug that experience the side effect of insomnia equal to or less than 5%. Okay, so again, it's a specific question related to a specific fixed value, 5%. And then finally, is mean amount of caffeine in a cup of coffee equal to or more than 111 milligrams? Okay, again, a specific question about a fixed value. Okay, if we define a hypothesis test, there's three things that we can say. It is a standard 4-step process designed to answer a specific question about a population parameter. And the two that we are focusing on are population mean, mu, and population proportion, p. Okay, so it's a 4-step process, and it's going to answer a specific question about either a mean or a proportion. Secondly, it determines whether a claim about a mean or proportion should be rejected or not rejected. Okay, so we're going to put the hypothesis test in terms of two different claims or two different hypotheses. And so the process that we go through is going to end with either rejecting a claim or not rejecting a claim. And hypothesis tests rely on sample data. All right, just like confidence intervals did. So let's talk a little bit more about hypotheses or these claims. If we have the question, is mean private university by state tuition equal to $20,000, we can put that in terms of two contradictory claims. One would be the mean tuition is equal to $20,000. And then the contradictory claim would be mean tuition is not equal to $20,000. Okay, so we can go from that question into two separate claims that are contradictory to each other. Okay, they can't both happen at the same time. If we look at the next example, the question is percentage of patients who take a new migraine drug that experience the side effect of insomnia equal to or less than 5%. So we have one claim that the percentage with insomnia is equal to 5%, and a contradictory claim is that the percentage with insomnia is less than 5%. Okay, so we go from that question to two different claims. Now, what about the mean? The question is the mean amount of caffeine in a cup of coffee equal to or more than 111 milligrams. So that tests the claim that mean amount of caffeine is equal to 111 milligrams versus the contradictory claim that the mean amount of caffeine is more than 111. Okay, take a moment and write out the claims for this next question in words and also in symbols, and then we'll look at it together. Okay, this question is the mean hours of work per week for George Fox undergrad students equal to 15.6 hours. So that is going to test the claim in words. Mean hours of work equals 15.6. And the contradictory claim is mean hours of work is not equal to, does not equal 15.6. Okay, so we use does not equal to there because the statement doesn't say anything about less than or greater than or more than. Now, using symbols, this is about the mean, so it's mu, and it's this first claim is mu equal to 15.6, and then the contradictory claim, we have a not equals there, so mu not equal to 15.6. Okay, one way we can think of a hypothesis test, it's like putting the claim that includes the equals on trial. So the claim that includes the equal sign, we're like putting that on trial. So if we think about what we know about jury trials in this country, we start with the assumption of innocence. So we start by assuming whoever's on trial is innocent, and then it's up to the prosecution to put forth the evidence that will make it impossible to maintain that belief of innocence. And then they're found guilty. But if the prosecution doesn't put forth enough evidence, then the jury can't set aside that assumption of innocence, and they will be found not guilty. So let's look at the claim, the mean by state tuition for private universities is equal to $20,000. So we're going to start by assuming that that claim is true. Okay, it's the claim with the equals in it. So that's what we base the whole hypothesis test on, is that claim or that hypothesis is true. So instead of evidence, what we have is sample data. And if sample data provides enough convincing evidence that the claim is not true, all right, we will reject it. If the sample data does not provide enough convincing evidence, then we do not reject that claim of equality. So let's go through the steps of a hypothesis test and compare that to what it looks like in a jury trial. So we're assuming that the claim about equality is true. That is, that mean tuition is $20,000. The comparable statement for a jury trial is that we assume the defendant is innocent, that they did not commit the crime that they're accused of. Okay, so that's the first comparison. Secondly, for a hypothesis test, we take a sample, we get a sample data from our population of interest. We calculate the sample mean and standard deviation or the sample proportion, depending on what it is that we're testing about. That's comparable to evidence being gathered by the prosecution and then being presented to the jury in the court proceedings. Okay, so taking that sample, calculating the sample statistics, that's like the evidence gathered by the prosecution and presented during the trial. All right, the third part of hypothesis testing is assessing the probability of getting that sample mean. Let's cross that part off. Assessing the probability of getting that sample mean under the assumption that the true mean tuition is $20,000. So if you think about, each of you calculated a sample mean based on the sample that you were assigned last week for confidence intervals. So what we're doing here is we're assessing the probability that you got that sample mean given, this is like, a conditional probability, given or assuming that the true mean tuition is $20,000. Okay, that's comparable to the jury assessing the probability or likelihood that innocence can be maintained in light of the evidence presented by the prosecution. So the fourth step says if the probability that we assess is really small, like less than 5%, then we have to question the assumption that we are holding on to. That in this case, the mean tuition is equal to $20,000, and we have to reject it. And then the contradictory claim is accepted. So if we get a really small probability that we would get that sample mean, under the assumption that the real population mean is a certain value, or in this case $20,000, if that probability is really small, then we just basically have to say, well, our assumption is probably incorrect, and we reject the assumption that we're making. So comparable in jury trials, if there is reasonable doubt that the assumption of innocence can be maintained in light of the evidence, then the assumption of innocence is rejected and the defendant is found guilty. Okay, so if the evidence is just so strong that the defendant committed whatever the crime was, such that the jury cannot maintain the belief of innocence, then they have to reject that belief. They have to reject that assumption that the defendant is innocent.